Have you ever thought about how countries are actually run? I mean, from kings and queens who inherit their power to presidents who are chosen by the people. It can all feel pretty complex, right? Well, today, we're going to demystify all of it. Let's dive into our explainer on 13 major forms of government.
So, here's our game plan. First, we'll tackle the big fundamental question: who's really in charge? Then, we'll look at two totally opposite answers to that question: systems where power is held by just a few people, and systems where it's shared among everyone. And finally, we'll get into the blueprints. The ideologies that act like the operating system for it all.
All right, let's kick things off with Section 1. Who's in charge here? Because honestly, before we can get into any of the different systems, we have to understand this one core idea.
You see, every single system of government we're going to talk about today is basically built on the answer to this one question: who holds the power? And that answer, it shapes everything, from a country's laws and its economy right down to the day-to-day lives of its people.
So that leads us to our second section, where we explored the first big answer to that question: systems where all the power is concentrated in the hands of just one person, or maybe a very, very small group.
First up, we've got monarchy. Think of this like a family business, where power gets passed down through the generations. It's actually a spectrum. On one end, you have symbolic monarchies, like in the UK, where the monarch is more of a figurehead. But on the other end, you have absolute monarchies, where the ruler's word is literally law. And the big risk here? Well, leadership is basically an accident of birth, not a test of skill.
Next is autocracy. This is where one person or a single party holds all the cards. Their decisions are absolute, and there are no real checks or balances to stop them. A classic example would be Stalin's Soviet Union, and it just goes to show, when one person has that much control, the potential for abuse of power is just massive.
Then you've got oligarchy, which literally means rule of the few. In this system, power doesn't come from a royal bloodline, but usually from wealth or military might. And get this, while it's not officially hereditary, power often stays locked within these elite groups for generations, which can create some pretty deep social and economic divides. And then we get to the most extreme form of centralized control: totalitarianism. The term was actually coined by Mussolini, and it's when the state tries to control, well, everything: politics, the economy, and even what people believe. A modern example is North Korea. In regimes like this, individual freedoms and human rights are almost entirely wiped out.
So this chart really helps lay out the key differences, right? Whether the power comes from your family, from absolute authority, from money, or from some state ideology, the result is always the same. Power is concentrated right at the very top. Each one gives a very clear, top-down answer to that question of who rules.
Okay, now let's completely flip the script. For our third section, we're moving away from systems of concentrated power and jumping into the ones designed to put power right into the hands of the people.
And that brings us to democracy, an idea born way back in ancient Athens. Here, the citizens are the supreme rulers. They get to decide on leaders and laws through a majority vote, and basic human rights are usually respected. So what's the downside? Well, it can sometimes be a little unstable, because of the constant changes in leadership.
Now, a very close cousin to democracy is the republic, an idea that has its roots in Plato's philosophy. The core idea here is that the state is basically public property. It belongs to the people. And since they own it, citizens elect representatives to govern for them.
So, what's the actual difference? It's subtle, but it's really important. In a pure democracy, the people rule directly. In a republic, the people elect representatives to rule for them. And that's exactly why a country can be both, like the Philippines, for example, which is a democratic republic.
But how in the world do you govern a massive, really diverse country? Well, that's the problem that federalism tries to solve. It's a system that splits power between a main central government and smaller regional governments like states or provinces. The United States is probably the most famous example of this.
Yeah, a great way to think about it is like a sports team. The central government is the head coach, setting the national strategy. And the state governments are the assistant coaches, managing their local teams. It's a pretty smart way to delegate, but it can also lead to inequalities, because some teams end up having way more resources than others.
All right, on to our final section, the systems blueprint. I want you to think of these not as governments themselves, but more like the operating systems or the rule books that different governments run on.
A constitutional framework is a perfect example of this. All it means is that there's a supreme law, a constitution, that defines and limits the government's power. So you can have a constitutional monarchy or a constitutional republic. Its biggest strength is stability, but that's also its biggest weakness, because constitutions are designed to be really hard to change, even when change might be needed.
Two of the most common structures you'll see are presidential and parliamentary systems. The key difference all comes down to the relationship between the leaders and the lawmakers. In a presidential system, the executive, the president, is separate from the legislature. But in a parliamentary system, the executive, the prime minister, is actually chosen from the legislature. This one little difference completely changes the balance of power.
Now let's dig into a couple of major economic ideas that really shape governments. Under socialism, people can own private property, but the government steps in to control how goods and services are distributed to try and create more equality. The whole goal is to level the playing field. But a common criticism is that if you equalize all the outcomes, you might reduce the incentive for people to innovate and work harder.
And then you have communism. Now, in theory, the way Karl Marx saw it, the ultimate goal was a classless, stateless society where all property is shared by everyone. But in practice, it's meant a system where the state takes total control of the economy, gets rid of all private property, and tries to distribute all goods and services equally.
But, despite its huge influence on history, today there are only 5 countries that are officially communist.
And they are China, Cuba, Laos, North Korea, and Vietnam. In practice, these regimes have often been marked by pretty severe restrictions on personal freedom and, unfortunately, human rights abuses.
And finally, we have the non-government option, anarchism. This is just the total absence of a central government. Now, the goal here isn't chaos. It's for people to govern themselves and cooperate with each other willingly for the good of the whole community. The danger, of course, is that if self-interest wins out, well, it can lead to chaos. So where does all this leave us? I mean, from the absolute power of a king to the shared responsibility in a democracy, it's pretty clear that every single system involves some kind of trade-off. Each one has strengths, and each one definitely has flaws. Which leads to one last big question for you to think about. Is a truly perfect form of government even possible?